So yesterday, the United States seized a Russian oil tanker, prompting some in Moscow to label this an act of war that needs to be met with a military response. Now, personally, I would say this shows that when they're actually confronted by the U.S., Russia backs down. Now, this comes alongside news from President Zelensky that bilateral security guarantees between the United States and Ukraine are ready to be signed by President Trump. Now, diving into the ship seizure yesterday, Reuters reports, quote, the United States seized a Russian-flagged oil tanker that was being shadowed by a Russian submarine on Wednesday after pursuing it for more than 2 weeks across the Atlantic as part of Washington's efforts to block Venezuelan oil exports. It appeared to be the first time in recent memory that the U.S. military has seized a Russian-flagged vessel. The Marinera, originally known as Bella 1, had previously slipped through a U.S. maritime blockade of sanctioned tankers in the Caribbean and rebuffed U.S. Coast Guard efforts to board it. Now, our understanding is as this vessel moved across the Atlantic, the crew of the Bella 1 painted a Russian flag on the side, and around that time, this ship showed up in a Russian ship register as the renamed Marinera. Now, Russian military vessels were reportedly in the vicinity during the operation, including a Russian submarine. It's not clear how close they were when this boarding took place, but most of the reports I've seen have the Russian naval vessels a full day away. So there's no indication that there's any sort of standoff, if you will, between U.S. and Russian military assets here. Now, U.S. European Command put out a statement explaining exactly what happened here, saying the Justice Department and Homeland Security, in coordination with the Pentagon, announced the seizure of the MV Bella 1 for violations of U.S. sanctions. The vessel was seized in the North Atlantic pursuant to a warrant issued by a U.S. federal court after being tracked by the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Monroe. This seizure supports President Trump's proclamation targeting sanctioned vessels that threaten the security and stability of the Western Hemisphere. The operation was executed by DHS components with support from the military, showcasing a whole-of-government approach to protect the homeland. Now, the Russian responses here were pretty wild. The government was relatively muted, saying this is not okay, we don't accept this. But when you get into some of the Russian military and political commentators, they're outright calling this an act of war, saying it needs to be met with force. But before diving into the Russian responses, a quick thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me. So have you ever been on an app or a website that requires age verification? More and more platforms are doing this now, but essentially they require that you upload a picture of a driver's license or a passport, so you have to prove that you are who you say you are. Now, Discord started doing this a little while ago, and this past fall, hackers broke in and stole that data, like the pictures of their users' government-issued ID. Now, to be clear, the users here didn't do anything wrong. A third-party service that Discord uses was compromised, and hackers stole government ID photos, emails, payment information, names, purchase history, and more. And with access to data like that, bad actors can piece together a profile of where you live, your job, income, religious or political affiliation, and more. And I don't think very many of you want that information floating around out there. I certainly don't. And that's where tools like Delete Me come in. Delete Me is a subscription service that constantly scans the internet, and when they find your personal data available for sale on people search websites, they have it removed. I personally use Delete Me, and here's a look at my most recent report where they reviewed 2,697 listings, found and removed one listing that contained 10 pieces of my personally identifiable information. Then looking back, one listing was removed in October, 11 in August, and 2 in June. And that's why the subscription aspect here is so important. This is the kind of thing that isn't one and done. You've got to stay on top of it, or like I prefer, have Delete Me stay on top of it for you. So if you want to protect yourself and your family from these data brokers, get started with Delete Me today. You can scan the QR code on the screen or use the link in the pinned comment and the description below, and be sure to use code Preston for 20% off all consumer plans. And of course, thank you to Delete Me for sponsoring today's video. So starting with the Russian Foreign Ministry, they said, quote, the landing by U.S. troops on a civilian vessel in open sea and its actual seizure, as well as the capture of the crew, cannot be interpreted as anything but a massive violation of the fundamental principles and norms of international maritime law, and also freedom of navigation. Now, quick note on the crew. Russia has demanded that the crew be returned to their home of record, suggesting that it's Russia. I would actually be kind of surprised if the crew here is Russian. Most of the crews on these international vessels are just from all over the place, including a lot of third world countries, as kind of a way for folks to earn money, a good living, and send that back home. Maybe these end up being Russians, but in all likelihood, they are not. Now, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said that the people on the crew on this ship have the possibility of facing criminal charges back here in the United States. So that seems to be unresolved at this point. Now, I think a great assessment here actually comes from Russian military or mil blogger, military informant. I think he hit the nail on the head. He said, quote, "In the end, we ourselves created problems. First calling the tanker our own and urging not to touch it. And then after attempts to capture the tanker, we were unable to do anything to protect it. Once again, it turned out that empty diplomatic statements don't scare anyone anymore. Now all that remains is to evade and complain to the United Nations. An attempt to demonstrate one's strength, not backed by real strength, turned out to just be a joke." Again, I think they hit the nail on the head, and this is really important, the timing, when you consider that, as this was going on, there were significant talks happening between the Coalition of the Willing and Ukraine in Paris, as well as the United States, and it sounds like some real tangible results came out of that. And I think it's really important here to see that when Russia was faced with U.S. military assets, albeit not a ton. I mean, we got a Coast Guard cutter and a couple other assets in the region. It sounds like 160th SOAR, of course, again, taking part in this operation. And the first reports I saw was that Navy SEALs conducted the boarding. But that's all it took for the Russian Navy to stand down. Something to consider as we move into these peace talks. Now, Russian mill blogger Two Majors called the ship seizures an act of war by the United States against Russia, saying the only way to respond is with military force. Another mill blogger here, Alexander Kotz, said, quote, "If the Americans seize our ship and we just talk about red lines, this will convince Trump that we're just a very large Venezuela, that Russia can be pushed around at will. There will be no effective response. And the American president will start getting bold on the Ukrainian track, putting forward conditions for a peaceful settlement that we know we can't meet. And it will all end with the U.S. Army standing on the front lines of a military confrontation and Tomahawk-carrying ships who are into the Black Sea. And that's just one step away from nuclear war," end quote. I think there's some validity to that. Again, there's an argument to be made right now that President Trump is feeling the success of recent operations. If you go big picture here, you've got the bombing of the Iranian nuclear facilities that, by all accounts, went pretty well for the United States. Then you've got the capture, apprehension of Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela just this past weekend. Again, by all accounts, went pretty well for the United States. If you're President Trump right now, don't you kind of feel you're riding a bit of a wave and maybe decide to take more risks that would have been off the table just a few months, even weeks ago? Russian analysts are seeing this as well, saying this came a little bit out of nowhere. This may have been viewed as a signal to Russia that even now, the way that I see this is this ship was going to be boarded, was going to be interdicted one way or the other. And when Russia painted their flag on the side of it, they were trying to signal, don't touch it. This is now belonging to a nuclear power. Don't you dare do it. And the United States didn't back down. That is a very, very important signal being sent, and does suggest that the United States might be on board. In fact, the White House mentioned this yesterday with boarding more ships, not just those sanctioned in and around Venezuela, but also those that may be connected to the Russian shadow fleet. That's a major step in this conflict if it actually plays out, and it's something that a lot in Russia right now are visibly concerned about. Now, the timing here is interesting as well because it happened alongside talks in Paris between the Coalition of the Willing, the United States, Ukraine, and others. President Zelensky came out of that relatively optimistic, saying a bilateral document on security guarantees for Ukraine is practically ready to be finalized at the highest level with the President of the United States. Bilateral, meaning between the United States and Ukraine. That would be significant. I haven't heard anything to date to suggest that we're that close to actually getting a security guarantee in place. But before you get too optimistic here, German Chancellor Merz just a few hours ago kind of threw cold water on everything, saying, quote, "The whole thing just doesn't work without Russia's consent, and we're probably still quite a ways away from that." And a note on a lot of this as well, the Russian consent has been so frustrating from the get-go. Russia wants to be a party to monitoring the ceasefire. So Russia wants to be able to watch as conditions play out on the ground and have veto authority over whether or not Western troops step in or a no-fly zone is enforced. So Russia, being the one that in this case would be, violating a ceasefire, would then have the ability to say, actually, no, nobody can come in and do anything about this. It is ridiculous on its face, but that is the stance that Russia is taking in these peace talks. Now, the UK, France, and Ukraine signed a declaration of intent, according to the Kyiv Post. They said they signed a declaration of intent on Tuesday for deploying a multinational force in Ukraine, backed for the first time by the United States as part of a potential peace deal. The U.S. for the first time has offered to support the force in case of an attack, in a development that has been described by European leaders as game-changing. President Zelensky said that allies had made detailed plans on force deployment, numbers, specific types of weapons, and components of the armed forces required and able to operate effectively. Steve Witkoff, the U.S. Special Envoy, added to this, saying, "We have made significant progress on several critical work streams, including our bilateral security guarantee framework for a prosperity plan." Again, this is stuff that would be huge if true, but it's hard to tell at this point. I mean, we've heard a lot of things that are moving in the right direction. Signing a declaration of intent, I guess, kind of sounds good. That seems to me like something you could also brush aside and say it's actually meaningless, because it's just saying this is what we plan to do at some point in the future. It's certainly not legally binding. Now, the readout had some interesting points here from this summit that I thought were worth running through. The security guarantees in particular laid out a few components. They said, one, participation in a U.S.-led ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism. I feel like we've been back and forth on this for a while, but being put in writing that the U.S. is going to lead ceasefire monitoring and verification is notable. They say support for the armed forces of Ukraine. The coalition has decided to continue providing the armed forces of Ukraine with long-term military assistance and weaponry, essential to maintaining their capabilities. They say a multinational force for Ukraine has been created through contributions from willing nations within the coalition. These actions will be led by Europe with the support of non-European coalition member states and the participation of the United States. My understanding is right now the coalition of the willing is made up of more than 30 individual countries. So that is a pretty significant bloc. They say binding commitments to support Ukraine in the event of a new armed attack by Russia in order to restore peace. These commitments may include the use of military capabilities, intelligence and logistical support, diplomatic initiatives, and the adoption of additional sanctions. Now, Russia has pushed back on this again. I mean, they continue to push back on any progress towards a negotiated settlement here. Their foreign ministry spokesperson called the statements, the ones I just read out to you, militarist declarations from an axis of war. They rejected them as dangerous and destructive, saying that Western troops or facilities set up in Ukraine will be considered legitimate military targets for the Russian armed forces. Now, I want to stress the addition of those military forces into Ukraine is not during the fighting. In fact, German Chancellor Merz hit on this earlier when he said there is no one here, not even a single member state in the EU or beyond, who is of the opinion that we should go into Ukraine now to intervene in the ongoing conflict. We're only talking about military security for a peace, for a ceasefire agreement. So to pick that apart real quick, Russia is saying any Western troops in Ukraine enforcing the ceasefire after a negotiated settlement is agreed upon would be considered a valid military target for Russia. Like, they're trying to veto that entirely. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Merz with a little added cold water here said, the order must be first a ceasefire, then security guarantees for Ukraine for a long-term agreement with Russia, and the whole thing just doesn't work without Russia's consent. And we're probably still quite a ways away from that. So I'm torn on this. I think it's good. It's positive. It seems like everything is moving in the right direction, but I'm not sure we're any closer to an actual end state, if that makes sense. It's great if the United States and the coalition of the willing and Ukraine all get on the same page, but if they're genuinely waiting for Russia, for Putin to say, okay, this is good enough, we're on board too, that day may never come. So it'll be interesting to see what the U.S., the coalition of the willing, and Ukraine do to try to force that. I think the timing of the Russian vessel being seized by the United States plays into this pretty well. Now, in Russia, it's not all positive. We turn to our favorite doom poster over there, Igor Girkin, we should note. a war criminal, convicted war criminal for the shooting down of MH17 civilian airliner, and he's been jailed in Russia for his anti-government rants, is probably the best way to put it. He communicates through a lawyer. He said, quote, "This year, of course, no compromise will be reached because there simply can't be one. The situation will continue to escalate. I suppose that after a while, Trump will demand that we accept the plan agreed upon with the United States and Ukraine. After we refuse, new sanctions will be imposed upon us, and the new participants in the coalition of the willing will be unleashed against us. It's quite possible that this year, Russian troops will have to deal with new units and formations of this coalition on the front as well." I don't think that's in the cards, personally. I do not think we're any closer today to Western troops being utilized in the war. He says, practically with 100% certainty, we can predict an intensification of sanctions and a naval blockade by the European Union. The naval blockade might actually be in the cards now. We definitely might see an increased operations against the Russian shadow fleet, not just by the United States. And I should note, the Royal Navy, the British Royal Navy, took part in that seizure as well. It would not be crazy to see our European partners step up in that regard as well, especially if they have the backing and the support of the United States. Gherkin says, because 4 years is already too much, and even more will mean the exhaustion of Russia, much more than the exhaustion of its opponents. In general, I don't have any good forecasts for this year yet because there are no positive signals. Again, we're talking about kind of a mix here of these talks that are frustrating at times to follow. I get it. I'm right there with you. We want to take these words and interpret them as positive, or we're moving towards some sort of agreement or a deal or a sustainable long-term peace. And we've been talking about that for over a year now at this point, right? I get it. The ship seizure is interesting how it ties into this and could signal increased pressure on Russia that we haven't seen in some times, really at all since this war began. And we had mentioned yesterday from U.S. Senator Lindsey Graham that the president is seemingly on board with a new package of Russia sanctions. So big picture, I would just want to have this possibility that recent actions, be it Iran, Venezuela, and now the seizure of this ship, it's possible, may have prompted President Trump and maybe some of those in his inner circle that there is more leverage to be applied against Russia and that we actually have that leverage. And when we push, Russia is genuinely scared of direct military confrontation, not just with the United States, but with NATO writ large. So maybe this opens the door for added pressure that has not yet been applied, certainly during this administration. Fingers crossed, time will tell. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.